"There's no seat for you here, Emily." Daniel's voice cut clean across the long white table, smooth as polished glass, loud enough for every guest to hear but soft enough to feel intentional, like a knife placed gently where it would hurt the most. The chandelier above cast a warm golden glow, reflecting off crystal glasses and silver cutlery, but none of it reached her. 12 chairs lined the table, each one occupied or reserved, each place marked with a name in elegant script, and hers was nowhere to be found. A few people glanced up, then quickly down, pretending not to notice, while others didn't bother hiding their smirks. Emily Carter stood still at the head of the table, her fingers resting lightly against the back of an empty chair that clearly wasn't meant for her. She didn't pull it out. She didn't ask. She simply looked at it for a second too long, as if measuring something no one else could see. Across from her, Daniel Brooks leaned back in his seat, one arm draped casually over the chair beside him, his cufflinks catching the light as he smiled at the woman sitting to his right. "You can stand if you'd like," he added, almost kindly, which made the quiet laughter ripple a little louder. Somewhere behind her, a server paused, unsure whether to move forward or wait. The air felt tight, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for a reaction, for embarrassment, for something human and breakable. But Emily didn't give them that. Her shoulders stayed relaxed, her chin level, her expression unreadable. She let the silence stretch, not awkward, not defensive, just still. A few seconds passed, then a few more, long enough for the laughter to fade on its own, long enough for curiosity to replace amusement. She shifted her gaze slowly from the empty chair to the table, then to Daniel, meeting his eyes without challenge, without warmth, as if she were looking through him instead of at him. The faintest hint of a smile touched her lips, not for him, not for anyone, but for something only she understood. And then she did the one thing no one expected. She didn't sit down. The silence she left behind did not feel empty, it felt deliberate, like something placed carefully on the table where everyone could see it, but no one could touch, and for a brief moment Daniel's smile held in place just a second too long before he shifted in his seat, adjusting his jacket as if the room had suddenly grown warmer. "Well," he said lightly, tapping his glass with a fork, "some people just never learn where they belong," and a few polite chuckles followed, thinner this time, uncertain, because Emily still had not moved. She did not step back. She did not reach for the chair, she did not ask for space, she simply stood there as if the absence of her name on the table meant nothing at all, and that was what unsettled them, because everyone in that room understood unspoken rules, invitations, status, hierarchy, and yet she stood outside all of it without apology, without explanation, as if she had already decided those rules no longer applied to her. Her gaze drifted across the polished surface of the table, past the carefully arranged place settings, past the branded folders stacked near the center, lingering for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, not in confusion, but in recognition, like someone looking at something that used to belong to them. Something familiar that had been quietly taken and repackaged, and across from her Daniel continued speaking, filling the space with stories about growth, expansion, new partnerships, his voice confident, practiced. The voice of a man who believed he owned not only the company but the narrative that came with it, yet every now and then his eyes flickered back to her, checking, measuring, waiting for a crack that never came, because Emily's expression remained calm, almost distant. And if anyone had been watching closely enough, they would have noticed the smallest shift in her posture, not defensive, not hesitant, but grounded, like someone who was not waiting to be included, not hoping to be accepted, but simply present by choice. And somewhere near the far end of the room, a quiet conversation stopped as a man in a dark suit stepped through the doors, his arrival subtle, but commanding enough that a few heads turned instinctively, the kind of presence that did not need introduction, and while most of the room had not yet noticed him, Emily did, her eyes lifting just slightly, the faintest change in her expression, not surprise, not relief, but recognition, as if this moment, this exact second, had always been part of a plan no one else at the table knew existed. The man did not announce himself, Yet the shift in the room followed him like a quiet current, subtle at first, a few glances, a pause in conversation, the kind of attention that did not need to be asked for. And as he moved further inside, the light seemed to catch differently on him, sharp lines of a tailored dark suit, measured steps, controlled, deliberate, the presence of someone who understood exactly where he stood in every room he entered. And still Emily did not move, but something in her stillness changed, not visible to most, but there, a quiet alignment, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived on time. Daniel continued speaking, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the shift, his voice growing slightly louder as he spoke about projections and partnerships, his hand gesturing toward the documents laid neatly at the center of the table, papers that carried his name in bold print, his future secured in ink. At least that was what he believed, and yet one by one, attention began to slip, drifting away from him and toward the man who had just entered, until even Daniel noticed it, his words faltering for a fraction of a second before he followed their gaze, his expression tightening just enough to betray recognition, not familiarity, but importance, the kind that could not be ignored, and for the first time that evening, uncertainty brushed against his confidence, light but real. While across the room Emily's eyes met the man's for only a brief moment, no smile, no nod, just a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them like something already agreed upon long before tonight, something that did not need to be spoken out loud, and then her gaze returned to the table, to the empty space where her name should have been, where it once had been, before contracts were rewritten and roles were reassigned without her, and if anyone had been watching closely enough, they might have seen the smallest movement of her fingers against the back of the chair, not gripping, not reaching, just resting there as if to remind herself of something steady, something real. While Daniel cleared his throat and forced a smile back into place, lifting his glass again as if he could pull the room back to him. "Let us continue," he said, but the words no longer held the same weight, because something had already shifted, something quiet and irreversible, and Emily remained exactly where she was, not seated, not invited, but no longer invisible. The room did not fully understand what had changed, but they could feel it, like a shift in temperature that no one could explain, and while Daniel continued speaking, his words now sounded like something being repeated rather than believed. Emily's attention had already moved elsewhere, not to the man in the suit, not to the table, but inward, to a memory that still carried the weight of early mornings and quiet determination, a small cafe tucked between a dry cleaner and a bookstore, the smell of fresh coffee beans filling the air at 5:30 every morning, her hands moving steadily as she wiped down counters, balanced receipts, packed orders, a routine that looked ordinary to anyone passing by but was built on something far from simple. Because behind that counter was not just survival, it was structure, control, something she could own after everything else had been taken from her, and there had been nights when the lights stayed on long after closing, when spreadsheets replaced menus, when ideas replaced exhaustion, when she sat alone with a laptop, mapping out something no one else could see yet, something small at first, almost invisible, but growing with each quiet decision she made, and it was there, in that quiet space, that she had first noticed him, not as a stranger but as a presence that returned without interruption, always at the same table near the window, always ordering the same black coffee, always observing more than speaking. Alexander Hayes had never asked questions he did not already understand the answers to, and when he finally spoke, it had not sounded like curiosity, it had sounded like certainty. "You built more than this place," he had said once, setting his cup down with quiet precision. "You built a system," and Emily had not responded, not because she disagreed, but because she did not need to confirm what she already knew, and now, standing in this room filled with polished surfaces and borrowed confidence, that same certainty returned, steady and unshaken, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if everything that had led her here had already prepared her for this exact moment, not to reclaim a seat, not to prove a point, but to stand exactly where she was without needing permission from anyone at the table. The memory did not fade when she returned to the room. It settled into her like a steady pulse, and just as quietly as it had come, it aligned with everything unfolding in front of her. Because Alexander Hayes was no longer just a man in the corner of a cafe or a figure entering unnoticed, he was now standing close enough that the details became undeniable, the precision of his presence. The way conversations around him adjusted without instruction, and while most of the room was only beginning to recognize him, Emily had already known exactly who he was the moment he stepped inside, not from headlines or reputation, but from the consistency of his attention. The way he had watched her build something from nothing without interruption or interference, and Daniel, now fully aware that the focus of the room was slipping beyond his control, straightened in his chair and offered a polite nod in Alexander's direction. The kind reserved for someone important but not yet threatening, Mr. Hayes, he said, forcing an ease into his tone that did not quite reach his eyes. We were just getting started, and for a brief second it seemed like the evening might continue along the lines he had planned, until Alexander's gaze moved past him, not dismissive, not rude, simply uninterested, and landed on Emily with a clarity that shifted the balance of the room again, not dramatically, but enough that those paying attention felt it, like a door opening quietly in a place no one had noticed before. And Emily did not react in any obvious way. She did not step forward, did not acknowledge him with anything more than the smallest lift of her chin, but it was enough, because it was not recognition that mattered, it was alignment. And somewhere between that silent exchange and the tension building across the table, the narrative Daniel had been controlling began to loosen, thread by thread, as if it had never been as secure as he believed, and still Emily remained standing, her hand resting lightly against the chair, not as someone waiting to be invited, but as someone who had already chosen not to accept the invitation at all, her calm no longer passive, but intentional. As if every second she stood there was part of something already set in motion, something that did not need to be announced to be real. The tension no longer hid beneath the surface, it moved through the room in quiet currents, subtle but undeniable, and Daniel felt it slipping further from his grasp with every passing second. His fingers tightening slightly around the stem of his glass before he set it down with controlled precision, as if small movements could restore order to something already shifting beyond him. Since everyone is here, he said, forcing his voice back into command, we might as well proceed with the announcement, and a few heads turned back toward him out of habit rather than interest, while others remained angled toward Alexander, waiting without knowing exactly why, and Emily stood exactly where she had been, unmoved. Her presence no longer overlooked, but not yet fully understood, a quiet center in a room built on louder displays, and then Daniel gestured toward the documents at the center of the table, glossy folders marked with his company's name, each one placed with deliberate symmetry. Tonight marks a major step forward, he continued, his tone steady again, practiced, a partnership that will take us into a new level of growth, and as he spoke, a server stepped forward to distribute the folders. Placing one in front of each guest, the soft sound of paper against polished wood echoing gently in the silence, until one folder remained, set carefully near the empty space where Emily's name should have been, untouched, unclaimed, and for a brief moment no one reached for it, as if even that object had become part of something larger, something waiting to be revealed, and across the table Daniel allowed himself a small smile. The kind that came from believing the narrative had returned to him, that whatever distraction had entered the room would now be absorbed into his moment, but he did not notice the way Alexander stepped closer, not hurried, not hesitant, simply present in a way that did not ask permission, his gaze moving over the table, over the documents, and finally resting again on Emily, and in that quiet exchange something aligned completely. As if every piece had fallen into place exactly as intended, and Emily's fingers lifted slightly from the back of the chair, not to pull it out, not to sit, but to let it go entirely. Her hand falling calmly to her side as she shifted her weight forward just a fraction, a movement so small It could have been missed, but it changed everything, because she was no longer positioned beside the table. She was stepping into the moment itself, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as someone who had been expected all along, whether anyone else had realized it or not. The movement was subtle, but it drew attention in a way no words could, because Emily was no longer standing beside the table as an afterthought. She was now positioned within its space, and that alone shifted the balance enough for people to notice. Conversation slowing, eyes lifting, the quiet realization spreading that something was about to unfold that had not been part of Daniel's plan, and he felt it instantly, the change in focus, the way the room no longer moved in rhythm with him, his smile tightening as he leaned forward slightly, attempting to reclaim control with familiarity. "Emily," he said, her name carrying a tone that was meant to sound casual, but landed sharper than intended. "I think you might be a little confused about how this works," and a few guests glanced between them, unsure whether to look away or keep watching, because there was something different in the air now, something that made even discomfort feel like anticipation. And Emily did not respond right away. She let the silence sit between them, not heavy, not defensive, just present, her eyes steady on him as if she were giving him the space to hear his own words. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even, carrying no trace of tension. "No," she said quietly, "I understand exactly how this works," and that was all, no explanation, no argument. Just a statement that did not rise to meet his challenge. And that unsettled him more than any confrontation could have, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to dismiss, only certainty, and across the table a few people shifted in their seats. The earlier confidence in the room beginning to dissolve into something quieter, more cautious, as if they were witnessing a conversation that operated on a level they had not expected, and Daniel let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Though it lacked warmth, then you should know," he added, gesturing lightly toward the empty space. "This is not your place anymore," and for the first time that evening, Emily's gaze moved from him to the chair, then back again, not with hesitation, but with clarity. As if the meaning of that statement had already been considered long before it was spoken, and instead of stepping back, instead of correcting him, she simply remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her calm intact, as though the idea of belonging to that place had already lost its relevance. And somewhere just behind her, Alexander stopped, close enough now that his presence could no longer be overlooked, not interrupting, not intervening, just there, and the room felt it, the quiet edge of something about to turn. Something that would not need to be announced to be understood. The room held its breath without realizing it, because the moment had already begun to unfold in a way no one could reverse, and Daniel felt it slipping fully beyond his reach now, his confidence no longer steady but forced. His hand pressing flat against the table as if grounding himself in something that was no longer his to control. "This is not your place," he repeated, quieter this time, as if saying it again could make it true. But the words landed differently now, weaker, because they no longer defined the space, and Emily did not challenge him. She did not correct him. She simply let the statement exist, her gaze calm, her posture unchanged, as if she had already moved past the need to belong to anything he could define. And then Alexander stepped forward, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough that his presence became undeniable, his voice measured, composed, carrying the kind of authority that did not need to be raised. "Actually," he said, his eyes moving briefly across the table before settling with quiet precision, "this evening is about a transition," and the words settled into the room like something heavier than it sounded, drawing attention back to the documents resting in front of each guest, the same documents Daniel had introduced with confidence only moments before, and now every eye turned toward them again, but with a different understanding, a different weight, as if the meaning inside those pages had shifted without anyone noticing, and Daniel straightened slightly, his expression tightening as he tried to follow the shift. "Yes," he replied quickly, attempting to regain alignment. "As I was saying, this partnership will move us forward, But Alexander did not look at him when he spoke next, his attention remaining exactly where it had been. "The acquisition has already been approved," he said calmly, and the room stilled, not in confusion, but in realization, because something in his tone left no space for interpretation, and a quiet murmur moved through the guests as pieces began to connect. The documents, the timing, the presence that had entered without announcement. And then came the detail that changed everything, delivered without emphasis, without pause, as if it had always been obvious. "Final authorization was co-signed earlier this week," he continued, his gaze lifting slightly, "by Ms. Emily Carter, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was complete, absolute, the kind that does not wait for explanation because it already understands." And Daniel did not move, his expression caught between disbelief and something deeper he could not name, while Emily remained exactly where she stood, not elevated, not triumphant, simply present, as if nothing about this moment required her to change at all. No one reached for their glass, no one turned a page. The room remained perfectly still, as if any movement might break something that had just been revealed, and Daniel's hand slowly pulled back from the table. Not with intention, but because it no longer seemed to belong there, his eyes fixed on the document in front of him as though the words might rearrange themselves into something he could understand. Something that would restore the version of reality he had been certain of only minutes before. But nothing changed. The ink stayed exactly where it was, and across from him Emily did not move closer, did not step away. She simply stood in the quiet center of everything, her presence no longer questioned, no longer dismissed. But not exaggerated either, just steady, as if this moment was not a victory to claim but a truth that had finally surfaced. And then a chair shifted softly as someone at the far end of the table stood, followed by another, and then another. Not in applause, not in spectacle, but in recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that moved through the room one person at a time until the balance had completely shifted, until the table itself no longer belonged to the narrative Daniel had created around it. And a space opened near the head of the table, a chair drawn back slowly, deliberately, the kind of seat that had once defined authority in the room, and all eyes turned toward Emily, waiting, expecting, because this was the moment where everything would resolve into something visible, something final. But Emily's gaze rested on the chair only briefly before lifting again, her expression calm, almost distant, as if the object itself no longer held meaning, and she took a single step forward. Not toward the seat but past it, her movement quiet but absolute, leaving the chair exactly where it was, empty, untouched, and as she walked toward the far end of the room the light followed her in a way that felt unspoken, drawing every eye without demand, without effort. And when she reached the doors she paused for just a fraction of a second, not to look back at Daniel, not to measure what had been lost or gained, but simply to exist in that stillness one last time before moving on. And then she continued forward, the doors opening without hesitation, without resistance, and closing just as quietly behind her, leaving the room, the table, and every seat within it exactly as they were, while the meaning of them had changed completely, because she had never needed to sit down to belong, she had only needed to stand long enough for the truth to reveal itself.